Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Joanna Margaret, and I have a PhD in history and an MFA from NYU, where Joyce Carol Oates was my thesis advisor, and I'm the author of the novel The Bequest, and I am thrilled to introduce each of our panelists today. Over here we have Barbara Rae-Venter. So I'm just going to give you a little bios. So after retiring from a career as an intellectual property attorney, Barbara volunteered with DNAadoption.org and assisted a number of adoptees in identifying their biological parents using genetic genealogy. Using the same technique, Barbara worked with the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department Crimes Against Children Detail to identify Lisa Jensen, who had been abducted as an infant. This was the first use of genetic genealogy to solve a criminal case. Barbara subsequently assisted the FBI and the Sacramento District Attorney's Office in identifying Joseph James D'Angelo as the notorious Golden State Killer, GSK. To date, she has assisted law enforcement in solving about 75 criminal cases. Yay, Yay Barbara! And then over here we have David McConnell. David McConnell's newest novel is The Beads. He is also the author of The Fire Brat and The Silver Hearted. His short fiction and journalism have appeared widely in magazines and anthologies. His narrative account of hate crimes, American honor killings, desire and rage among men, won the American Library Association's Stonewall Book Award for nonfiction. S.A. Cosby. S.A. Cosby is a New York Times best-selling and award-winning author of Southern noir crime fiction. He has published 4 novels, My Darkest Prayer, Blacktop Wasteland, Razorblade Tears, and All the Sinners Bleed. His newest novel, King of Ashes, will be published this summer. He lives in southeastern Virginia. So excited to be here with these amazing panelists. So I'll start with David. I just have a few questions for everybody individually, and then we can sort of open it up. But,
sure, sounds great.
David McConnell very brilliantly pointed out yesterday that murder is by nature always a family affair. So I'd like to delve a little more deeply into that and start with you. So could you tell us a little bit about American honor killings? What made you, mostly a novelist, decide to write this nonfiction book, which covers notorious real-life, brutal murders of gay men and is sort of like your own in cold blood?
Oh, thanks. I think it was because I was so frustrated with ordinary journalism, correct journalism. You know, the way journalism should be done left me really unsatisfied. And I would read through an account of something. It didn't have to be murder, but almost anything. And the rules of journalism say you just follow the facts. And the way they end up strung together didn't look like real life to me at all. And because I had kind of a fascination when I was younger with, you know, the extreme edges of experience, and murder was definitely there, I was particularly noticing that, you know, if there would be an account of a murder in the newspaper, it made no sense to me. I wanted vividness. There was no vividness. I wanted details that didn't exist. I wanted more of a novelist's voice. And so I thought, oh, well, I can do that. And I found that I was able to do it up to a point. But there are compromises that you end up making. So I'm not sure, you know, I didn't remake journalism. I mean, journalism should stay the way it is. But, you know, what I did was just try to bring to life some of those stories.
Yeah, well, it's really brilliantly written, and I recommend it to everybody here that has not read it, because it's incredible. Then, because of our family theme, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about meeting with the families of some of the victims of these horrific crimes. So, for example, meeting Mort Domer, Steve Domer's brother, murdered by Darrell Madden and Bradley Pauls.
Yeah, that was really sobering. And, you know, as I said, I was kind of, you know, had this fascination with the extremes of life. You know, there was almost a kind of gruesome fascination, or I questioned myself about that. And so when I actually went out, you know, as a novelist, I had never done this before. I'd never gone, you know, to meet people on death row and, you know, talk to them. Or, you know, it all felt very unnatural to me. And in the course of that, of course, I had to talk to the families of people who were murdered, the families of Bradley Quall's sister, for instance, I spoke to. And it was very humbling because, you know, it sort of does, you know, the reality of it is pretty overwhelming. And I think I mentioned yesterday, you know, how overwhelming murder is for families. And, you know, we can all imagine it, you know, but we can't at the same time. I mean, it really is something extraordinary. And you're changed forever. And you have no control over it. And it's one of those, you know, incredible unfairnesses in life. And very difficult to deal with.
Wow. And then lastly, did you have any interesting surprises while you were researching, writing this project, and discoveries that you might have made?
Well, yeah. I mean, with the case you mentioned, the Steve Domer case, he was murdered. He was murdered by a guy named Daryl Madden in Oklahoma. And I met Daryl Madden, and I actually kind of liked him. I mean, we kind of got along in a way that was rather disturbing. And I discovered his background, which was really kind of incredible. Of all the murderers in the book, he was the only one who was actually gay. But he was also secretly, or, you know, on the down low, a member of skinhead gangs, and, you know, would, you know, regularly gay bash and attack people for exactly the same thing. You know, he would go from working in a gay bar as a dancer to, you know, running around with his pals and beating guys up. So anyway, he was this absolutely fascinating character. I think a psychopath, you know, because I was really, really vulnerable to this guy's charm. Anyway, I write about him, and he seems to me to be boasting about all these other crimes he's committed. And sure enough, you know, 10 or 15 years later, I was contacted by the police in Los Angeles, and there was a very famous case there about a young porn actor who had been murdered, and it became a very sensitive issue in Los Angeles, a famous case, in fact, because I think he was a cute kid, and everybody wanted to know, like, well, how did he end up, you know, decapitated in a garbage bin in Los Angeles after coming from a sweet family in Eau Claire, Wisconsin? You know, that's this trajectory that, you know, breaks everyone's heart. And it's a part of the LA story, I think. Black Dahlia is kind of similar. And anyway, you know, it had become this big issue, especially in West Hollywood, and they had been searching and searching and searching for this guy. They even sort of thought it might be Jeffrey Dahmer for a while because of the decapitation. And someone had read my book and gave it to the cops, and they read him making these boasts, and it all sort of lined up. So I got contacted by the police, and they said, "Do you think it's worth our going to interview him?" And I said, "Absolutely. You know, he'll be very forthcoming." And indeed, he did. He confessed.
Wow, that's really powerful. That's incredible. Well, I wanted to, that's a great segue into to Sean Cosby. Your wonderful novel, Razorblade Tears, tells the story of two ex-convicts, one black and one white, who take matters into their own hands when their married sons are murdered. Can you tell us about your inspiration for writing such an unexpected and compelling narrative, and were you inspired by any real-life cases?
Yeah, so Razorblade Tears was inspired by a relative of mine, a cousin. My father has 11 brothers and sisters, so I have a lot of cousins. I said this yesterday, but it's true. I live in a small town. I'm related to like half the people in the town. And so my cousin is about the same age as I am. And early on, he graduated high school and moved to Atlanta and made a life for himself down there. As kids, we all knew he was gay. We knew it from from childhood. He was just our cousin that was gay. It didn't mean a lot to us, but his mother and father, my aunt and uncle, very conservative Southern Baptist family. And so for years he hid it. He was in the closet. And he would bring his partner up from Atlanta for like family reunions. And he would always say, well, this is just my roommate, and so on and so forth. And one year, he called me ahead of the reunion. He says, hey, I'm coming up, and me and blank we're gonna tell my mom and dad that we're together. He said, are you gonna be at the reunion this year? And I was like, yeah, I'll be there. And he said, good, I really could use the support. And went to the reunion, and it did not go well at all. It was just really a horrible, awful, emotionally draining scene. And so after that, my brother and I took him out for a beer. We said, let's get out of here, let's go hang out. And my brother, I love him, but he's not always the most sensitive person in the world. And so as we were discussing the issue, my brother was like, so you and blank, y'all are like gay together, right? And my cousin was like, yeah, we've been together. He said, are you happy? Like, did he make you happy? And my cousin was like, yeah, we're very happy. My brother was like, well, fuck it, be gay together, be happy. And so my cousin said, you know, maybe I should just kept it to myself. Maybe I should have told mom and dad. And him saying that broke my heart, because I just could not conceive of a world in which the people that are supposed to love you unconditionally don't, you know? And it started me thinking about, what does that mean in small Southern communities? But specifically, what does that mean in small Southern Black communities? There's a preeminence on masculinity in small Southern communities. Growing up, when I was a kid, the two worst things anybody could call you were the N-word and the F-word. And sometimes the F-word was worse than the N-word. It was a challenge to your masculinity. I mean, we live in a world where grown Black men are called boy by men who are 20, 30 years their junior. And so when I started writing Raising Big Tears, I wanted to sort of talk to those men who are homophobic, to those men who have sons or daughters or non-binary children, who you think you're going to have enough time to repair this relationship. Somebody's going to come around. A lot of times that doesn't happen. And so I started the book with the idea that these men have lost their sons, and now it's too late for them to make an amends within that world. But they try their best to solve a crime. It's a very hyperbolic book, it's a lot of violence, but at its core, it's a story about regret and redemption and what it means. And and I use facts in the book. I did research, gay crimes, murders are not investigated as vigorously as straight or hetero murders. And so in the book, that's what happens. The police kind of just give up on the investigation. And so these two very rough-hewn men decide to take matters in their own hands, and through that, they try to redeem themselves. It's so funny because when I finished the book, I sent the early draft to my cousin, and he calls me, he's like, I'm very touched that you would do this, but are you gonna be okay? Like, what are people back home gonna say? I don't give a fuck. I really don't. I think if you're a writer, you tell lies to find the truth. And for me, the truth of that is that, love is love, and, all that matters, is that we have people in our lives that care for us. And I really wanted that to be the story of the book. So, the book, it's like a cake. The frosting is the violence and the wood chipper scenes and stuff like that. But then the actual cake is the subtext, the love and the care and the understanding that comes from that. So I did research for that book. To what Dave was talking about, when I did All the Sinners Bleed, which is about serial murders, I did a lot of research from that. And it was funny, I got to talk to a retired behavioral science agent from the FBI. And it was so funny because it was very cloak and dagger, because he didn't want his identity revealed. So a friend of mine who's a reporter did like a three-way call. He was like masking his voice and everything. But the one thing he told me that I tried to work into the book, he says, when you write about this serial killer, he can be cunning, he can be smart. He said, but don't make him a genius. They're not geniuses. And there's a line in the book that's a paraphrase of something he said. He said, evil is not complicated, it's just bold. And I thought that was such a powerful statement that, he said that killers will do what everybody else won't. And sociopaths don't have fear. And so that's just how they get away with stuff. He mentioned Edmund Kemper, who's a serial killer from California in the 70s. Edmund Kemper got pulled over by the police with 2 dead bodies in his trunk and talked his way out of a ticket. Meanwhile, I get pulled over for driving while black. But anyway, and so I worked that into the book and into the sort of identity of the killer, but also the way that the detective, the sheriff sort of investigates it. So real world research is filtered through a fictional prism. And so you use it, you want to write in a way that it makes it seem like you know what you're talking about, but not in a way that it's a instructional tone. So.
Totally. Okay. Oh, that's great insight. So I was going to say that not only do you put together such a riveting plot and deeply drawn characters, but the American South is almost like a character in its own right in your books. Can you talk a little bit about how it figures into your book?
Yeah, I mean, the South is the site of America's original sin, in my mind. You know, it's a place, you know, where the soil is seeped in blood and regret and pain, you know, but also there's beauty and, you know, magnificence there if you're willing to look for it. You know, you have to sort of parse that sort of the horridness and the grotesqueness of American history is intermingled with the beauty and the love of family and tradition that comes from the South. You know, like I said, my dad comes from a big family. My mom had a big family. Family is, you know, sort of this cornerstone bedrock of the American South, but it's also where the first sort of traits of corruption come from. You know, we all have families and have family secrets and families that, you know, my mom was adopted and I didn't know it until she was 73, you know, and so there's sort of this tradition in the South of big families, large families protecting each other, looking out for each other, but also hoarding their secrets like dragons hoard gold. And so the American South is sort of a representation of that. You know, I like to say there's no place more confused by its future and more constrained by its past than the South. But having said all that, you know, to sort of paraphrase James Baldwin, you know, I love the South. I love being a Southerner. I love being a part of that sort of long storytelling tradition that goes back, you know, beyond Faulkner through Alice Walker, Ernest J. Gaines, people like that. But because I love it, I reserve the right to criticize it. You know, people always ask me, like, why do you write about the South? Why do you still live there? You know, I feel like every scrap of land that a good old boy that walks on that waves a Confederate flag, that's a neo-Confederate apologist, someone who looks like me has bled and died and lived there. I have as much right to the South as anyone else. And so I will be damned if I cede 1 inch to some kind of neo-Confederate apologist, you know. The church that I used to attend was founded by my great-great-grandfather in 1867. And so who has more right or bona fides to the history of the South than people in my family, people like me? And so again, I think, you know, the South is a microcosm for the rest of the country, I think. And so when you write about it, I think it's important to write about it in an honest way, but also not in a condescending way. You know, like for instance, I got, when they were sending me audition tapes for the audio narrator for my book, I got like 4 or 5 audition tapes, and like 4 of them were terrible because the narrator, I think, they had this idea of the South, so when he went to do the narration, he sounded like Foghorn Leghorn, you know, so it's like, I'll say, we're gonna rob a bank, and it's like, you know, and it's not like that. And so the gentleman who ended up being the narrator, a wonderful narrator, Adam Lazard White, is originally from South Carolina. And so he understands the nuances of what it means to be a Southerner, both in the past and in the modern time. And so, you know, it's funny, the South is like, the South is like a cousin or a brother. I can talk about it, but you can't.
Well, please do continue to write about the South, and I'm very excited for King of Ashes coming out. So I wanted to talk to Barbara. So the past few years have been very exciting in the field of investigative genetic genealogy. How have scientific advances informed your practice?
So the advances that have really informed the practice are just really, well, there's two types. There's increases in scientific abilities in being able to extract meaningful DNA from smaller and smaller samples. When I first started out, we needed over 1,000 times more DNA than we do now.
Wow.
Which is just a huge difference. So if you're working with things like sexual assault kits, where there is not a lot of DNA in some of the cases, that becomes very significant in whether or not you're going to be able to use investigative genetic genealogy. The other side is when I started out working on the Lisa Jensen case and on the Golden State Killer, there were no tools available. There were some tools becoming available to help adoptees use DNA to find their birth relatives. But in terms of some of the tools that we have now, where we can use tools that predict where in a family tree the person we're trying to identify must belong, just using statistics, that's huge. Before we had to really basically get down to the point when we had one person, well, like I did with Joseph D'Angelo, where I was able to get to the point where I could use eye color to identify who it was that I was looking for. One of three of the guys that had blue eyes. We'd have had to have done a lot more work before we zoned in on him.
Well, I Know Who You Are is really an incredible book, and I recommend it to everybody who hasn't read it, because it's really riveting and goes into all the details about. So I wanted to ask, can you tell us about the most famous criminal case you helped solve, unmasking the identity of the Golden State Killer? There's a powerful moment in your book when you came face to face with Joseph D'Angelo in a courtroom. So I wanted to know what it was like to be in the room together with him and some of his victims and their families, who were finally getting justice after so many years, thanks in large part to your hard work.
I think my overwhelming emotion when I saw him come into the courtroom, he's hunched over in a wheelchair, looking totally pathetic. I was so angry because when law enforcement had him under surveillance the day before he was arrested, he was riding his motorcycle on the freeway at 100 miles an hour. There was nothing wrong with him. They have pictures of him in his cell doing burpees.
Wow.
For those of you who don't know what a burpee is, it's doing a push-up and then jumping to your feet. Absolutely nothing wrong with this man. So he was cheating these people who were there for justice. He was cheating them of seeing the authentic Joseph James D'Angelo.
Wow, that's really powerful. Well, it's interesting to hear about how all these psychopaths manage to, assume other identities, and I mean, that's clear from all three of you. So I wanted to ask the panel sort of more generally, can we explore how each of you write about the implications of crime and violence on families and family members, for whoever?
Okay. Yeah, I was actually, there's a curiosity about this that I had when people were talking about, memoirs about their own family. And it occurred to me that a lot of the people that I spoke with after the book came out and they read it, they were generally, kind of grateful that it had been done and how it had been done. And the only thing, because you feel like you're transgressing, and in fact you are, you're writing about somebody's most private moment ever. It's already been elevated to unwillingly elevated to a public event, but it's still incredibly private. And so that was also, as a novelist coming to this, that was a humbling experience. So I was very grateful to get that response. But I also, like the memoirists, it was just particular details that they wanted to get right. And so it was, no, he was facing the other way. I mean, down to that level of detail. And it was enormously important. And I think it represents some deep attachment to the truth. They want to know this, we've now established what really, really happened. And that's this enormously satisfying thing. And, if you can participate in it a little, it's great. Yeah.
I think as a fiction writer, when I write about victims, I really endeavor to not make the victims just cannon fodder. Like in Raised by Tears, the death of Buddy Lee and Ike's individual sons, Isaiah and Derek, it weighs on them so heavily. I've been around the funeral business, funeral home. I worked in a funeral home for a while, and I sort of had this sort of really interesting view about how grief manifests itself. Grief can be, torturous crying. Grief can be laughter about a past memory. Grief can be stony silence. But grief is never ending. It never stops, really. There is no timetable for it. You never get over it. You work through it. And so when I write about victims in my books, because of course my books are violent, people do die, good people sometimes die, I don't want to give short shrift to that idea or that feeling that, it's not, the body's just not a prop. That was somebody that meant something to someone. That was somebody who had hopes and dreams, desires, love, and people that would love them. And so with All Sinners Bleed, there's a scene where, so for people that haven't read the book, the plot of All Sinners Bleed is the first black sheriff in a small southern town discovers that a beloved high school teacher, a former student, and a third mystery person were a trio of serial killers, which I based that on a serial killer out of Texas named Dean Corll, who had 2 assistants when he was terrorizing Houston. And there's a scene where Titus finds these bodies of young black boys and girls who have been murdered, and they identify one of the victims. He goes to the mother's house. He drives. He doesn't have to. They're like, you should call her. He's like, no, I'm going. And he has this conversation with her, and he promises her that he's going to catch the killer. And in that moment, he tells himself, I shouldn't promise. I shouldn't say this, but I can't help myself. Because the pain this woman has felt, it's just so palpable. It's so immersive that he feels this sort of Old Testament righteousness within him that I've got to help these people. And I took that from like the interviews that I did with not only the profile, but also I was lucky enough to talk to some former sheriffs. I talked to the first black sheriff in Virginia, who's not that old, so that's a whole nother conversation. But for me, the victims and the victimology and how we talk about them is really important. I think you want to make sure that you honor the victim's memory, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I think sometimes with the whole obsession with true crime, that a lot of times, I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, we lose sight of that. We lose sight of them, that these were real living people. This isn't just material for you to get clicks. And so, like I said, when I write the fiction that I write, I definitely work really hard to make sure that the victims matter as much to the reader as they do to the characters.
Well, even in the title, Razor Blade Tears, and those scenes, and Ike sort of crying, and that whole image, really portrays the grief of 2 fathers just so beautifully, and so that's really, really compelling.
Thank you.
So one thing all 3 of your books share as a common thread is this idea sort of toxic masculinity in America today, and how racism, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia can combine with this sort of toxic masculine ideals and incel culture to create a deadly combination. And I was wondering if you want to address that a little bit. Anybody?
I mean, yeah, I think there is this sort of unfortunate movement in America. I mean, America's always been misogynistic and racist and homophobic. But I'm old enough to remember where it seemed like the tide was shifting, especially after the AIDS epidemic and the horrible way that was handled. Like, I grew up in the 90s, and it seemed like, I'm not trying to be facetious, but you saw people like RuPaul, you saw people like, Johnny Versace, you saw folks who were gay, men and women, you saw women, ascending to leadership roles and roles in entertainment. Catherine Bigelow wins the Oscar. She's the first woman director to win the Oscar for The Hurt Locker. And so you felt like, oh wow, this tide is turning. And what happened, I think, was this sort of very aggressive, sort of mendacious pushback by traditional horrible themes in America. I think that dovetail with the sort of isolationism that we have now, based around social media, that people have become very siloed, very insular. People don't talk to each other anymore. I think it's so, not hilarious, but I think it's so telling that there's a whole generation of kids, I say kids, but 25, 26-year-olds who don't want to talk on the phone. They can't. My niece is a Navy vet who literally goes to a panic attack about talking on the phone. And so this weird sort of thing that we can't involve and engage with each other. And when you don't do that, you have this sort of incel culture that pops up because people are not exchanging ideas with other individuals. They're just stuck in a rabbit hole, and they're listening to, Jordan Peterson tell them to make their bed like that's some great wisdom and revelation to come down from Mount Sinai. It's not. And so I see that a lot when I write. A lot of times people will read my books and they'll see the violence in there, and they'll think, oh, these guys are tough guys, these guys are real. That's who I want to be like. You're not supposed to emulate that. You know, violence is a confession of pain. And so when I write, I definitely try to articulate that, but I wanted to throw that to David.
Well, I think, Barbara, we were talking about this yesterday, and I think you had kind of a different view about it, at least in respect to your cases.
Well, yeah, because you were talking about, well, a lot of the cases that I work on, I'm working on a whole series of sexual assault kits out of Cuyahoga County in Ohio. And you had described it as being a homophobic, or at least a overt masculinity type of crime. And I guess I don't see it that way. I see it as more just violence against women. So yeah, we definitely differed in how we were defining it.
Yeah. I guess, you know, going back to Daryl Madden, this absolutely, you know, mad but charming killer that, you know, who was really one of the most interesting people I've ever met, ultimately. He spent his entire life, you know, leading a double life because he hated gay people so much. He was gay, so he acted out, and yet at the same time he would do this, you know, he would join these skinhead gangs and attack gay people. It was really kind of crazy. But after my book was done, and after, you know, he's been in prison for 10 years, he transitioned to being female. And so, you know, Daryl Madden went to being Darylyn Madden now. And it's really kind of an incredible story, you know, where this is someone who, it's like uranium or something melting down. You know, that issue, and I know from my personal experience too, you know, that issue when you're a young man, it's just so intense. You know, I mean, boys are thrown together, you know, it's really like growing up, or can be like, you know, growing up with a bunch of dogs. And it's very intimidating, it shuts you down, you turn things off, and if you're gay often, you'll just start to hate yourself.
I did want to mention that, like, I think also there's, to what you said about boys growing up being a young boy, there's this idea that, you know, boys will be boys, and then you know, boys got to chase and women got to run away, and then there's this whole weird hunter-gatherer dynamic that comes into relationships when it's really not like that. I remember my mother telling me, you know, like when I started dating, you know, my mom was a very, very strong character, and she would always tell me, you know, I don't care what you're doing with a woman, the moment she says stop, you stop. And I don't think a lot of men are told that. And I remember this horrible conversation I had. I was like 19. I was talking to some older men about this young lady that I liked, and one of them said, I was saying, I'm trying to get her to go out with me, and I like her, and I don't know what to do. And my dad wasn't really in my life at that time. I was with these older guys, and one of them said, you know what you do is you pick her up in your car, and you take her somewhere that she can't get away. And he asked her what she's going to do. And I remember thinking, that's rape. Like, that's rape. And in that moment, I also realized, you've done this. Like, you've done this to someone's daughter. And it was just such a watershed moment for me, you know. And I think what has happened now is there are a lot of men who think they're owed something because they're quote-unquote nice. I'm a nice guy, so you have to go out with me. And one of my friends who's a fiction writer, Jennifer Hillier, she has this great line in her book, just because somebody's nice doesn't mean they're good. And I think that we as a society have misconstrued this sort of false piety that comes with etiquette. And, you know, you shouldn't be nice in the furtherance of a goal that's something that you want. You should be nice because it's nice to be nice. And a lot of people aren't like that. And I think it manifests itself in sexual assault, in sexual violence against women, in violence, in violence in the homosexual community as well. This idea that I did X for you, so now you have to do Y for me. You know, and human relationships should not be reciprocal in that way. And I think it's really telling on our society that we grow up sort of to to embrace that. That's the way I was raised. I was raised like that, and I had to unlearn that. And I just don't think, this whole idea of young men like, we need our, the liberal side needs their own Joe Rogan, and these boys are being brainwashed. They're not being brainwashed. This is society's been telling men that since, the old joke about a caveman hitting a woman over the head and dragging her away. This idea that men are supposed to get what they want because they want it. And I think it's much larger than incel culture. I think it's much larger than social media culture. I think it's something that we need to really confront going forward. And like Barbara was saying, it's just a question of violence against women and violence in society that doesn't value women's lives.
So it's so fascinating to be sitting here with the three of you. Obviously, Barbara approaches her writing from a scientific and insider's point of view. But I was wondering more, Sean touched on this a little bit, but what do you and David have to do to bring to light the details in your stories, which are very true to life? And can you talk a little bit about your research process, and specifically in American honor killings?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. It goes back to my point about, my incredible dissatisfaction with these newspaper accounts. It was, it's a little like seeing skeletons or something like that. And, it doesn't really look like the animal at all. And in fact, in the Museum of Osteology, they have every animal skeleton, and they all look kind of the same. And you've seen, these recreations in, paleontological articles, where, the elephant has a nose or something like that. There are these key elements that aren't conveyed by the facts. And so I wanted to include those. The problem is, and the reason why journalism will always be journalism, is it involved my assumptions. In order to link one fact to the other, I had to say that's how it happened. And that's a very bold thing to do when you're writing nonfiction, obviously. I think, I was disciplined enough to get away with it, but you have to be really, really careful. And as a novelist, writing in these assumptions that you make, you can do it really well. It's possible to, or you can do it really badly, and then you'll end up with stereotypes because you won't, you won't be looking at a plausible link between what happened here and what happened here. But then, when you're done, you have this whole gestalt of, that is how it happened. It's, the sort of details fall away, and it is vivid. There is an explanation. There is something real there. And that's a really rewarding experience as a writer, so.
Yeah, and you do a wonderful job of bringing, characters and voice out, and it's very, all these literary techniques that you use, so that's very impressive. And then, because I feel like these facts and ideas need those things, so that's a wonderful thing. So I think I'll ask one more question, and then maybe we can open it up to the audience. So we have 10 more minutes. Are you working on any new projects that you want to give us a sneak peek on? Anybody?
Go for it.
Just my book, King of Ashes, comes out June 10th. It's another crime novel, surprise, surprise. Set in the South. It's about a family that owns a small town crematory, and the family is in debt to some very dangerous gangsters. And so it's the older brother, middle sister, baby brother. The older brother tries to take the lead to help the family get out from under this debt. But the family also has this trauma that they've experienced as young children when they were teenagers. Their mother disappeared, and everybody in town thinks their father killed her because she was having an affair, and everyone knew it. And so they've dealt with this their whole lives, and now this new traumatic experience that they're dealing with, trying to deal with these gangsters. And so that comes out June 10th. I'm very proud of it. I hope people enjoy it. I was trying to make the argument with my editor that it wasn't as dark and violent as my other stuff. And then she said, by chapter 8, somebody's had their teeth knocked out, somebody's been attacked by Caucasus mountain dogs, and there's been 2 people burned alive in a crematory. And I was like, Well, yeah, I mean, other than that.
Well, I personally can't wait for June 10th for King of Ashes to come out. Anybody else?
I am working on something, but it's it's a complete departure. Again, I mean, actually, writing about crime and real life was kind of a departure for me, so I'm going back. But I will tell you about a project I worked on for a very, very, very long time that I abandoned. And I've got about 1,000 pages of this book about one of my sources for American honor killings. This guy who's on death row, and I visited him. And we corresponded. I found out everything about his story. I wrote most of it. It's this very ambitious thing. I don't know if I'll ever go back to it. And it was really too overwhelming to me. I got to a certain stage in my life, and that kind of fascination with the darkest aspect of life was gone. I just realized how vulnerable we are, and now I'm very sensitive to that kind of thing, and so I have put it aside. I'd like to recover it somehow, but maybe I'll have to wait until I toughen up again.
Wow, that'll be a powerful one. Barbara and I discussed briefly that there might be some news about adaptations, and Sean and I discussed that as well. Maybe if you just have a minute to discuss what film and TV projects are on the horizon.
Well, I've been in discussions, and we're actually to the point of putting together a final deal with CBS to do a scripted series based on my book.
Wow.
Yay.
Very good.
That's terrific.
Do we know when it's going to come out?
I mean, we haven't even finished inking the
Okay.
contract yet.
And Sean.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, King of Ashes is going to be a TV series on Netflix, but I actually wanted to ask Barbara a question.
Yeah.
As a writer, as a crime writer who's been fascinated with crime and murder, serial killers most of my life, probably at a too young age, do you think the advent of genetic genealogy is going to eventually see sort of the extinction of the serial killer? I think we'll always have, obviously serial murders and stuff like that, but it seems like I remember being a kid in the 80s when it seemed like the Green River Killer would never be caught, and it seemed like, it took years to catch Ted Bundy and so on and so forth, and now it seems like with the Long Island serial killer, it went from they found his bodies to 5 or 6 years later they got him, and so I was wondering maybe if you had any thoughts on that. I was just curious.
So it's an interesting question, because actually we've identified a number of suspects in some of these rape cases I've been working on. And in those, several times when they've executed search warrants on these folks, and they take a look at their computers, they've been searching investigative genetic genealogy, and they had to have been expecting a knock on the door at some point. What's to be hoped is it will act as a chilling effect on some of these folks. Because, of course, a lot of the cases were like the Golden State Killer. They were active and leaving their DNA all over the state of California way before it was known that anything could be done with that in terms of identifying them. Now that that's out there, hopefully it will start acting as a deterrent.
Interesting.
Wow, okay, well, hopefully. So I just wanted to open it up to the audience. If there are some questions in the front.
My question is for you, Barbara. I know you're doing backlogs of these rape kits and identifying these people, but what do you think about the legal reform that's necessary to reopen statutes of limitations and things like this to really bring justice to these people? It's enough to identify the perpetrator, but will the legal system rush to keep up with the advances so that they can continue to bring justice to these people?
So what's actually being done is, you're correct, with the Golden State Killer, in his case, the statute of limitations had in fact run on most of the rapes that he was guilty of. And so in his case, what was done as part of his plea deal was he had to agree to sit in court and admit to every single one of those 50 rapes. What's being done currently, so the rape kits I'm working on out of Ohio, what they did there is they actually indicted the DNA. And so they're all indicted as John Doe number so-and-so. And so I've been working on, John Doe 67, John Doe 120, John Doe whatever. They're all, this statute of limitations is stopped by doing that indictment. And then a number of states are moving to actually extend the statute of limitations, because in many cases it was really quite short, like 5 years. And so, but the easiest thing obviously is just to go in and indict the DNA because it's so specific for an individual.
Other questions?
We have a question in the back.
So S.A., I came out to see you. The sun's not even out, so I usually stay home. But, you ever think we're gonna hear more about Titus?
You know what's funny? I usually write what I like to call closed circle books, like beginning, middle, and end, and I kind of leave those characters alone. And the response to him has been so crazy. Like, I go to book signings and people tell me like Titus is their literary imaginary boyfriend. Who did I base him on so I can hook him up? And I'm like, I made him up. He's not a real person. But it was funny. All the Sisters Bleed is going to be a limited series with Netflix also, and my agent worked into the contract that I will still own the character of Titus. Because a lot of times when you do these adaptations, you don't own the characters anymore. The TV series or the producer owns it now. And so he asked me, he's like, do you think Titus will come back? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I put him through so much in that book. He never gets no sleep. He gets stabbed, shot at, beat up. But then I had an idea for maybe bringing him back. I have a friend who is an Eastern Band Cherokee tribal member, and they just started, they got federal recognition, so they're gonna build a casino on the reservation, and they've had a lot of pushback in the community. And I don't know, something about that kind of stoked an idea, maybe he could come back and maybe there's a murder surrounding that. I'd love to talk about the intersectionality of Indigenous Americans and African Americans, especially in the North Carolina, South Carolina area, where there was a lot of intermarrying in those two communities, and how that sort of affects those two communities both together and apart. So he may come back. I mean, I need to give him let him get a nap for a while. So, but thank you, that's a great question.
Other questions? There's a question here.
Your work is so intense. What authors do you read for relaxation?
It's so funny. Dennis Lane, who's one of my idols, I love him. We were on a panel together once and got a similar question. And he went through this long speech about, I write these really intense books and I gotta decompress for like a month after I write them. And I really gotta get into a better headspace. And they were like, well, what do you do? And I was like, I go play with my cat. Like, that's, I don't know if that says more about him and me, because I write these really dark, intense novels, but some people that I do read for relaxation, I like to read classic novels, I'll reread Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor. I'll read comic books, I love comic books. I love movies, so once I finish a really dark, depressing, horrible story, I'll go see a comedy. Sometimes I go by myself. I just go and laugh maniacally alone in the dark. So that's still scary. But one of my favorite books to reread is A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy O'Toole. I just love the sort of satirical silliness of that book. I'll read the whole, Mr. Irving, who was here earlier, I read The Hotel New Hampshire. So books like that are very polar opposite to the stuff that I write. So, but it doesn't really bother me. I don't think I'm a sociopath, but it's like
You're not.
Well, I think we're at time, so just put a hand together for these wonderful, amazing writers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.